Welcome back to Quiz Guides. If you're new here, Quiz Guides are short crash course style videos to help beginner, novice, and intermediate players learn more about different Quiz Bowl topics. Today, I'm going to be talking about US presidents. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. So first, I'm going to talk about Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson was the president from 1801 to 1809, and his vice presidents were Aaron Burr during his first term and George Clinton during his second term. Some interesting clues and important clues for Jefferson. First, let's talk about some documents he wrote. So he wrote the Declaration of Independence, which you probably are familiar with. He also wrote the notes on the state of Virginia, as well as the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom and the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And he wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions with James Madison in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were a set of laws that were passed during John Adams's presidency, who was the president before Jefferson. And Madison and Jefferson disagreed with these acts, with these Alien and Sedition Acts. So they basically wrote these resolutions to talk about what they disagreed with in the Alien and Sedition Acts. Another thing about Jefferson was he was an architect, and he helped design a lot of different buildings. For one, he helped design and he founded the University of Virginia. He also designed his home, Monticello, which is in present-day Charlottesville, Virginia. And he based the design of Monticello on a building from Renaissance Italy, which is similar in design. And that building is called the Villa Rotonda, which was designed by the Italian architect Palladio. A famous thing about Jefferson is that he fathered an illegitimate child with Sally Hemings, who was a slave. He purchased Louisiana from Napoleon in the Louisiana Purchase, and he also sent Lewis and Clark on their Corps of Discovery to explore, Western United States and find a route to the Northwest Passage. Additionally, Jefferson fought against the Tripoli pirates in the Barbary Wars, which was like a series of wars that took place along the northern coast of Africa. And he also issued the Embargo Act, which basically made it illegal to trade with foreign nations in response to the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. And this Chesapeake Leopard Affair was actually criticized with this Oh Grab Me cartoon, which you can see right here. This turtle is actually named the Oh Grab Me turtle. And, he's like basically grabbing onto the guy who's holding the barrel. So that's sort of like a cartoon that was created in response or to like criticize the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. So I want to talk about some other clues or buzzwords for Thomas Jefferson. So one was that he appointed Albert Gallatin as his Secretary of the Treasury. He authorized creation of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in present-day New York. And like I mentioned earlier, he fought in the Barbary Wars. At the end of the Barbary Wars, they negotiated a treaty that was called the Treaty of Tripoli. And that was negotiated with the Karamanli dynasty. So that might be something you hear for Barbary Wars toss-ups. And you might also hear them for Jefferson toss-ups. So the Karamanli dynasty is important. And lastly, another building that Jefferson, I guess, spearheaded was the Virginia State Capitol. And that was based on this building called the Maison Carrée, which was built in Nimes, France. So he basically took a lot of inspiration from French and other European style architecture for buildings in present day America. All right, next I want to talk about James Madison. So James Madison was president after Jefferson from 1809 to 1817, and his vice presidents were George Clinton and Elbridge Gerry. And like I mentioned earlier about Madison, he authored the Federalist Papers, and this was alongside John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. John Jay was a Chief Supreme Court Justice, and at some point, I believe this was before that, and Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, another important clue was that Madison is known as the father of the Constitution, which is pretty famous. He also helped write the Bill of Rights. Another key thing that Madison signed was the Makin's Bill No. 2. And this Makin's Bill No. 2 was an extension of the Embargo Act. But the interesting thing about the Makin's Bill number 2 was that Madison reluctantly signed this bill. He wasn't actually in favor of it. So it's sort of counterintuitive, but he was pressured and to basically sign this bill into action. So it's a good clue to know that that he signed Makin's Bill number 2, even though he actually opposed what it was arguing for. And lastly, Madison was president during the War of 1812, and that was ended by the Treaty of Ghent. The War of 1812 might also be known as Mr. Madison's War. Some other clues about James Madison. So the famous case Marbury v. Madison, in which William Marbury sued James Madison, was where judicial review was established in the United States. That's a very important Supreme Court case. Madison also wrote the original version of the 27th Amendment. And he also signed the Second Bank of the US into law, which is interesting because he wasn't really in support of the First Bank of the US, but he did help sign the Second Bank of the US into law. And you can look more into that. There's quite a bit of information on his sort of disagreement with the original bank. And then he devised the Virginia Plan along with Edmund Randolph. And the Virginia Plan was a proposal for how the government was supposed to be divided. And it was proposing to have a bicameral legislature and 3 branches. And it was drafted by James Madison, but during the Constitutional Convention, when the Virginia Plan was brought forth, it was delivered by Edmund Randolph. So they sort of worked together on this, but Madison was more of the writer and Randolph was the presenter. Right. All right, next I'm going to talk a little bit about James Monroe. So James Monroe was president from 1817 to 1825 after James Madison. And Monroe's vice president was Daniel D. Tompkins. His presidency is known as the Era of Good Feelings, which is a very important clue for Monroe. And the reason it is given this name is because the Era of Good Feelings was a time when the US had one political party. And the party that was the opposition party to the Democratic Republicans was the Federalist Party, which died out in 1816. So essentially at that point, there was only one party remaining. So that's why there was not much political tensions in the country at that point. Therefore, it was known as the Era of Good Feelings, because everyone had good feelings for each other. A key thing that he signed was the Missouri Compromise, which dealt with how the free states and slave states were to be divided in America. And you might also hear the Missouri Compromise called the Compromise of 1820. During his presidency, there were two other major things that occurred. One was the Panic of 1819. And the Panic of 1819 was basically an economic crisis that stemmed from lower imports and exports that was pretty much the major part of it. And also there was declining agricultural prices. And this was due to the fact that the world had just, or not the world, but mostly the US had just dealt with the War of 1812. So, markets were kind of sort of readjusting to production and commerce after War of 1812. And so therefore, the country went into an economic crisis. And this was one of the, first major economic crises that the country faced. And it was called the Panic of 1819. Another event, or not event, but Supreme Court case that was important, like I mentioned earlier, you had Marbury versus Madison, which was when Madison was president, but this case, McCulloch v. Maryland, occurred during Monroe's presidency. This is another pretty important case that comes up in Quiz Bowl. You may not see it too much in regular high school toss-ups, but you might find it as a bonus or potentially a toss-up at higher levels. And the case of McCulloch v. Maryland was basically about the Bank of the United States. There was an attempt to restart the Bank of the United States, and the state of Maryland wanted to tax this bank. However, the Supreme Court said that Maryland, as a state, did not have the right to tax the bank since it is a federal institution. So that was sort of the debate going on in that case. Famously, John Quincy Adams was Monroe's Secretary of State, who later on became a president. And Monroe played a role in helping to sign a lot of treaties and enforcing many foreign policies. And I'll talk about a couple right now. So one is the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which dealt with the border between the US and Canada in the Great Lakes region. There was the Adams-O'Neese Treaty, which was a treaty with Spain. It's also sometimes known as the Florida Purchase Treaty. And as a result of this treaty, the US purchased Florida, basically from Spain. So that's very famous. That one comes up quite often, the Adams-Onis Treaty. It might be like a clue for Florida itself. Next, you have the Monroe Doctrine, which is you might have heard quite often. Basically, the Monroe Doctrine said that European powers were not able to develop colonies in the Western Hemisphere, like in the Caribbean or Latin America, and that the US will basically prevent those nations from Europeans from taking over. So that was sort of the whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine, basically keeping the rest of North America as free as possible from European incursion. Right, and some clues and buzzwords that you might hear from Monroe. So he famously sent Andrew Jackson to suppress an uprising in Florida during the First Seminole War. You can read a lot more about this, but yeah, Andrew Jackson, a lot of toss-ups just on Jackson deal with his time as a general and military personnel, and especially during the Seminole Wars. So this is important, but that he was actually sent on that by Monroe. Another important event that occurred during Monroe's presidency was the rebellion that was led by Gabriel Prosser, and actually this rebellion tried to kidnap Monroe at some point, but he was able to suppress the rebellion. And actually, I misspoke. I said that this occurred during Monroe's presidency. It was actually during the time when he was the governor of Virginia. So this rebellion took place when he was the governor of Virginia, and they almost actually kidnapped Monroe, but they were able to suppress the rebellion. In order to become president, Monroe defeated Rufus King, who was the last Federalist candidate. As I said, the Federalist Party sort of dissolved right before Monroe's presidency, which is why there was only one political party left in the country, and hence the era of good feelings. And lastly, this is a bit of a more specific clue, but or a bit higher level. You might see this at nationals or something like that, or maybe very early on in toss-ups at the state level. Monroe published this pamphlet titled "A View of the Conduct of the Executive." That's like its shortened name. It has a really long name, but you'll commonly hear like a part of the title, and the part that'll most come up is "A View of the Conduct of the Executive." And this is basically a defense of his term as Minister of France. That's really only the important thing about that. But knowing the name of it is good, and knowing that it was a pamphlet written by Monroe. This is obviously before his time as president. That's it for US Presidents Part 1. Be sure to check out the next video on Impressionism Part 1. Thanks for watching.